A young Apache woman is thrown into a raging river by her own people, left to drown because she can no longer walk. A lone cowboy sees it happen from a ridge above. He has seconds to decide, ride away or dive in and risk everything for a stranger condemned by her own blood. What he does next will shatter both their worlds and prove that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to look away. If you're ready to hear how one impossible choice became a story of survival, defiance, and rebirth in the unforgiving Arizona frontier, stay with me to the end. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The desert didn't forgive weakness. Colt Maddox had learned that long before he knew how to shave. He'd learned it the day his father died of fever in a wagon 3 miles from nowhere, learned it again when his mother remarried a man who beat her quiet, learned it every time he'd gone hungry because the cattle market crashed or the well ran dry. The Arizona Territory was a furnace in summer and a blade in winter, and it didn't care if you were good or bad, smart or stupid, brave or broken. It just waited for you to slip. He was 32 now, lean, weathered, with hands that could gentle a spooked horse or snap a man's wrist if the situation called for it. He didn't talk much, didn't see the point. Most people out here were liars or fools, and the ones who weren't usually ended up dead. Colt lived alone in a cabin he'd built himself, tucked into a canyon where the wind couldn't reach and the summer sun only touched the roof for a few hours each day. He had a horse named Rusty, a rifle he cleaned every Sunday, and a whiskey bottle he kept under the bed for nights when the silence got too loud. It wasn't much, but it was his. He didn't go into town unless he needed salt or ammunition. He didn't have friends. The last woman he'd kissed had stolen his pocket knife and left him sleeping in a barn outside Tucson. That was 4 years ago. He figured he was done with people. Then he saw the river. It was late afternoon, the kind of light that turned the red rocks gold and made the shadows long and sharp. Colt had been riding the high ridge above the canyon, checking for cattle that might have wandered off from a ranch 10 miles south. He didn't own cattle anymore, sold them all after a drought 2 summers back, but sometimes he hired out for tracking work when he needed cash. He wasn't expecting to see anyone. The river below was narrow and mean, choked with rocks and fed by snowmelt from the mountains. It ran fast this time of year, cold enough to stop a man's heart if he fell in. Colt had crossed it once on horseback and damn near lost Rusty to the current. That's when he saw them. A group of figures stood on the near bank. 8, maybe 10 people. Apache, by the look of them. Colt reined Rusty to a stop and stayed low in the saddle, watching. He wasn't looking for trouble. Apache weren't his enemies, not exactly, but out here you didn't take chances. Tensions had been high since the army pushed the tribes onto reservations, and there were plenty of men on both sides who'd kill you just for being in the wrong place. He could have turned around, should have, but something about the scene below made him pause. The group was gathered in a loose circle near the water's edge. Most of them were men, warriors, judging by the way they stood, but there were a few women too, older ones, wrapped in blankets despite the heat. They were focused on something in the center of the circle. Colt squinted. A girl. No. A woman. Young, maybe 20. She was kneeling in the dirt, her head down, her long black hair hanging loose around her shoulders. Her hands were bound behind her back. Colt's gut tightened. One of the men stepped forward. He was older, gray streaks in his hair, and he carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. He spoke. Colt couldn't hear the words, but the tone was sharp, final. The woman didn't move, didn't fight. 2 warriors grabbed her by the arms and hauled her to her feet. That's when Colt saw it. Her legs buckled. She couldn't stand. The men held her upright, but her body sagged between them, lifeless from the waist down. Her face twisted, not in fear, but in something worse. Shame. Colt's chest went cold. The old man gestured toward the river. No. The warriors dragged her forward. She didn't scream, didn't beg. She just hung there, limp and silent, as they pulled her to the edge of the water. Colt's hand moved to his rifle before he even thought about it. Don't, he muttered to himself. Don't be stupid. But his body wasn't listening. The warriors lifted her, one at her shoulders, one at her knees, and swung her out over the current. They let go. She hit the water hard, disappeared under the white foam, and didn't come up. Colt was already moving. Rusty nearly stumbled on the descent. The ridge was steep, all loose rock and scrub, and Colt pushed the horse harder than he should have. His mind wasn't working right. He knew that, knew he was about to do something reckless and probably fatal. But the image of that woman, bound, helpless, sinking, had burned itself into his skull, and he couldn't shake it. By the time he reached the riverbank, the Apache were gone. Colt swung off Rusty and ran to the water's edge, scanning the current. The river roared past, dark and violent, churning over rocks the size of wagon wheels. He couldn't see her, couldn't see anything but foam and shadow. "Damn it," he hissed. He kicked off his boots. The cold hit him like a fist. His lungs seized, his muscles locked, and for a second he thought he'd made a terrible mistake. But he forced himself forward, wading deeper, until the current caught him and yanked him downstream. The world became chaos. Water in his mouth, his eyes, his ears. Rocks slamming into his ribs, his shoulders. He couldn't tell up from down, couldn't breathe. Then he saw her. A flash of dark hair tangled in the roots of a half-submerged tree 20 yards ahead. Colt kicked hard, angling toward her, fighting the current with everything he had. His hand closed around her arm, slick, cold, too still, and he hauled her toward him. Her head lolled back, lips blue, eyes shut. He wrapped one arm around her chest and dragged her to the shallows, crawling up onto the muddy bank and collapsing beside her. She wasn't breathing. Colt rolled her onto her side and slammed his fist between her shoulder blades. Once, twice, nothing. "Come on," he growled. He hit her again, harder, and this time she convulsed. Water poured from her mouth. She coughed, a raw, choking sound, and sucked in a ragged breath. Colt sat back, chest heaving, and stared at her. She was alive. Barely. Her skin was pale, almost gray, and her lips were still that awful shade of blue. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her hands, still bound, were shaking violently. She coughed again, weaker this time, and her eyes fluttered open. They were dark, fierce, and full of something Colt couldn't name. She looked at him for a long moment, her breathing shallow and uneven. Then she passed out. "Kit." Colt carried her back to Rusty, draped her across the saddle, and started the long ride to his cabin. He didn't think, didn't plan, just moved. By the time he got her inside, the sun was setting. The cabin was small, one room, a stone fireplace, a bed in the corner, a table he'd built from scrap wood. He laid her on the bed and covered her with every blanket he owned. Her breathing was still shallow. Her skin was too cold. Colt built a fire, then peeled off his own soaked clothes and hung them near the hearth. He found a knife and cut the ropes around her wrists. Her hands were raw, the skin torn where she'd struggled against the bindings. He didn't know what to do after that. He wasn't a doctor, wasn't a healer. He'd patched himself up plenty of times, stitched cuts, set a broken finger once, but this was different. She looked half dead, maybe more than half. He boiled water, found a clean rag, and wiped the mud and blood from her face. Her breathing didn't change. He checked her pulse. Faint, but there. He pressed his hand to her forehead. No fever. That was something. Then he looked at her legs. They were thin, too thin. The muscles had wasted away, leaving nothing but skin and bone. When he touched her calf, there was no response. No twitch. No reflex. Just stillness. Colt sat back, his jaw tight. He'd seen men lose the use of their legs before. A fall from a horse. A bullet in the spine. It didn't matter how it happened. The result was always the same. In a place like this, where survival meant being able to hunt, to ride, to run, losing your legs was a death sentence. And her people had known that. Colt stood and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening canyon. He should have left her in the river. That's what anyone with sense would have done. He didn't know her, didn't owe her anything. And now she was here, in his cabin, half dead and completely helpless. If she lived, what then? He couldn't keep her, couldn't send her back, couldn't leave her to die. He just made his life a hell of a lot more complicated. But when he turned and looked at her again, small and broken in his bed, her hair still damp, her face pale, he felt something shift in his chest. She hadn't screamed when they threw her in. She hadn't begged. She'd just accepted it. And that, more than anything, made him angry. She didn't wake for 2 days. Colt stayed close. He fed the fire, boiled broth from salt pork and wild onions, and tried to get her to swallow a few spoonfuls when her eyes flickered open. She barely managed it. Most of the time, she just stared at the ceiling, her breathing slow and labored, like her body was still deciding whether to give up. On the third morning, she spoke. It was a single word, soft, rasping, in a language Colt didn't understand. He was sitting by the fire, cleaning his rifle, and her voice startled him so badly he nearly dropped the barrel. He crossed to the bed and crouched beside her. "You awake?" Her eyes found his. They were clearer now, though still shadowed with exhaustion. She said something else. Another string of syllables, sharper this time. Colt shook his head. I don't know what you're saying. She stared at him for a long moment, then tried to sit up. Whoa, hold on. Colt pressed a hand to her shoulder, gently but firmly. You're not strong enough for that. She ignored him, pushed herself upright anyway, wincing as the effort sent tremors through her arms. She looked down at her legs, still motionless under the blanket, and her expression didn't change. No surprise, no grief, just a kind of cold acceptance. Then she looked at Colt. Why? Her voice was rough, but the word was clear. English. Colt blinked. You speak English? She nodded, barely. Some. Missionary. Long time. She swallowed, her throat working. Why, you take me? Colt didn't have an answer for that. He should have had one. Should have been able to explain it. Some noble reason, some clear logic. But the truth was, he didn't know. He'd acted on instinct, and now he was stuck with the consequences. Didn't seem right, he said finally. Leaving you to drown. Her eyes narrowed. My people. Leave me. You see? Yeah, I saw. They right. Colt's jaw tightened. The hell they are. She looked away, her face hard. I am burden. Cannot walk. Cannot hunt. Cannot be strong. She touched her legs, her fingers trembling. Better I die. That's horseshit. Her gaze snapped back to him, surprised. Colt stood, his hands curling into fists. You think because you can't walk you're worthless? That's what they told you. She didn't answer. Well, they're wrong. He turned and stalked to the window, his anger building. You're alive. That means something. I don't care what they said. I don't care what you think. You're alive, and that's not nothing. Silence. When he looked back, she was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read. What is your name? She asked quietly. Colt. She repeated it, the syllable awkward on her tongue. Then she touched her chest. Ayla. Ayla, Colt said. She nodded. They looked at each other for a long moment, the fire crackling softly behind them. Finally, Ayla spoke again. You waste time. I will die anyway. Colt crossed his arms. Not if I can help it. Why? She asked again, and this time there was something raw in her voice. You do not know me. I am nothing. You're not nothing, Colt said, and I didn't pull you out of that river just to watch you give up. Ayla's eyes shone, but she didn't cry. She just looked at him. This stranger, this white man who'd risked his life for reasons he couldn't even explain, and something in her face softened. You are fool, she said quietly. Colt almost smiled. Yeah, probably, he chummed. Over the next week, Colt learned a few things about Ayla. She was stubborn, dangerously so. The kind of stubborn that made her try to stand on her own even when her legs wouldn't cooperate. Even when she collapsed and had to crawl back to the bed, her face tight with frustration. She was proud. She hated needing help. Hated that Colt had to lift her, carry her, do things for her that she couldn't do herself. She barely spoke. And when she did, her words were clipped and careful, like she was rationing them. And she was smart, observant. She watched everything Colt did, how he built the fire, how he cooked, how he cared for Rusty. She asked questions, her English improving a little each day, and she remembered the answers. But mostly, she was angry, not at Colt, at herself, at her body, at the world. Colt understood that. He'd felt it too, more times than he could count. One night, about 10 days after he'd pulled her from the river, Ayla asked him a question. Why you live here? Alone? Colt was stirring a pot of stew over the fire. He glanced at her. She was sitting up in bed now, her back against the wall, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Easier that way, he said. Easier? People are trouble. Ayla tilted her head. You not like people? Didn't say that. Just said they're trouble. You help me. I am people. Colt smirked. Yeah, and you're trouble. Ayla almost smiled. It was the first time he'd seen anything close to it, and it caught him off guard. You are strange man, she said. Been told that before. She was quiet for a moment, then said, My people. They are not bad. They do what they must. The weak cannot survive. In my tribe, if you cannot fight, cannot run, You are... She trailed off, searching for the word. A burden, Colt finished. She nodded. Yes, burden. They throw me in river because they cannot carry me, because I slow them down, because... Her voice cracked. Because I am broken. Colt set the spoon down and turned to face her. You're not broken. My legs. I don't give a damn about your legs, Colt said, his voice sharper than he meant it to be. You're breathing. You're thinking. You're fighting. That's not broken. That's alive. Ayla's eyes glistened, but she blinked it back. You do not understand. Maybe not, but I know what giving up looks like, and you haven't done that yet. She looked away, her jaw tight. Colt let it drop. He dished out 2 bowls of stew and brought one to her. She took it without a word and ate slowly, her hand still shaking a little. When she was done, she set the bowl aside and looked at him again. Colt. Yeah. If I ask you, help me walk again, will you? Colt's breath caught. He stared at her, trying to read her face. She wasn't joking, wasn't testing him. She was serious. I don't know if that's possible, he said carefully. But will you try? Colt thought about it. Thought about the impossibility of it, the pain it would cause her, the odds that it wouldn't work. Then he thought about the way she'd looked when they pulled her from that circle, the way she'd accepted her fate without a sound. Yeah, he said. I'll try. Ayla nodded, her face solemn. Then I will not give up. And for the first time since he'd pulled her from the river, Colt thought maybe, just maybe, he hadn't made a mistake. The next morning, Colt started planning. He didn't know the first thing about helping someone walk again, but he'd built a cabin from scratch, broken horses, survived winters that killed better men. He figured he could figure this out too. He started by testing her legs. He had her lie on her back while he lifted each one, bending the knee, checking the joints. There was no muscle tone, no strength. But the bones were intact, and when he pressed on her thigh, she flinched. You felt that? Yes. Little. That's good. That means the nerves aren't completely dead. He worked with her every day after that. Gentle at first, just moving her legs, stretching them, trying to wake up whatever was left. Ayla gritted her teeth through it, sweat beading on her forehead, her hands gripping the edge of the bed. Hurts? Colt asked. Yes. Good. Pain means it's working. She glared at him, but there was no real heat in it. After a week of stretching, Colt built something new. He took 2 lengths of wood, strong, straight branches he'd cut from a tree near the cabin, and lashed them together with leather straps. Then he carved notches where her legs would go and padded them with cloth. It wasn't much. Barely more than a frame. But it was a start. What is this? Ayla asked when he showed it to her. Braces, Colt said. You strap them to your legs and they'll hold you upright. Won't make you walk on their own, but they'll give you something to lean on. Ayla stared at the contraption, her expression unreadable. You think this will work? I think it's worth a shot. She nodded slowly. Then we try. Then, the first time Ayla tried to stand, she lasted 5 seconds before collapsing. Colt caught her before she hit the ground, his arms wrapping around her waist. She was lighter than he expected, all bone and sinew, and for a moment she just hung there, breathing hard. I cannot, she whispered. Yes, you can, Colt said. Try again. She did, and again, and again. Each time, she lasted a little longer. 5 seconds became 10. 10 became 15. Her legs shook violently, her face twisted in pain, but she didn't quit. Colt stayed close, his hands ready to catch her, his voice steady. Breathe. Don't lock your knees. Let the braces take the weight. I am trying. I know. You're doing good. On the 7th attempt, she stood for a full minute. When she finally collapsed, Colt lowered her gently to the bed, and she lay there gasping, her whole body trembling. I hate this, she said, her voice thick. I know. I hate being weak. You're not weak, Colt said. Weak people don't get back up. Ayla closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. Colt looked away, giving her space. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the canyon walls red and gold, and for the first time in a long time, Colt felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. 3 weeks passed, and the cabin became a different place. Not softer, nothing about the Arizona desert ever got soft, but less empty. There were 2 plates on the table now instead of 1, 2 cups. Ayla's blanket stayed draped over the back of the chair by the fire, and her hair tie, a strip of leather she'd braided herself, hung from a nail by the door. Colt hadn't planned for any of it, hadn't planned for her to still be here, but she was, and somehow that had stopped feeling strange. She could stand for 10 minutes now without collapsing. The braces helped, but it was more than that. Her legs were waking up, slowly, painfully, but waking up. She could feel pressure when he pressed on her calves, could flex her toes if she concentrated hard enough. It wasn't walking, not yet, but it was something. Every morning, Colt helped her strap the braces on. Every morning she tried to stand. And every morning she fell. But she got back up. He'd never seen anything like it. The sheer, stubborn grit it took to keep trying when your body refused to cooperate, when every attempt ended in failure, when the easiest thing in the world would have been to just give up and accept what everyone had already decided about you. Colt had worked with horses his whole life. He knew what it looked like when an animal broke, when the fight went out of them and they stopped trying. He'd seen it in men, too. Hell, he'd felt it in himself more than once. But Ayla wasn't broken. She was battered and scarred and fighting a losing battle, but she wasn't broken. And that scared him a little, because the more time he spent with her, the harder it got to imagine her leaving. One afternoon, while she rested on the bed, Colt sat at the table sharpening his hunting knife. The scrape of the whetstone filled the silence between them. Ayla was watching him, her eyes half closed, her breathing even. "You ever wonder what happens after?" she asked suddenly. Colt didn't look up. "After what?" "After I walk. If I walk." "You will." "You do not know that." "No," Colt admitted. "But I know you won't quit trying." Ayla was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And if I do walk, where do I go?" Colt's hand stilled on the blade. He hadn't thought about that. Hadn't let himself. Because thinking about it meant facing the truth. She couldn't go back to her people. They'd made that clear, and she couldn't stay here forever. Could she? "We'll figure it out," he said finally. "That is not answer." "It's the only one I've got." Ayla sighed and turned her face toward the wall. "You are a bad liar, Colt." He almost smiled. "Yeah, I know. Hot." That night, Colt went outside to check on Rusty. The horse was tied near the lean-to Colt had built for shade, munching on dry grass and looking unbothered by the world. Colt ran a hand down the animal's neck and stared out at the canyon. The moon was full, casting silver light over the rocks and scrub. It was quiet out here. The kind of quiet that pressed in on you if you weren't used to it. Colt had spent years learning to live with it, learning to prefer it to the noise of people and their problems. But now, standing alone under the stars, he realized something. He didn't want the quiet anymore. He wanted to hear Ayla's voice asking questions. Wanted to hear her laugh, something she hadn't done yet, but he had a feeling it'd sound good. Wanted to hear her tell him he was being stupid, which she did at least twice a day now. And that was a problem. Because wanting things out here got you hurt, got you disappointed, got you dead. Colt knew better than to want. But apparently, knowing better didn't stop it from happening. He stayed outside longer than he needed to, putting off going back in, putting off facing the fact that he was in way over his head. When he finally went inside, Ayla was asleep. Colt banked the fire, pulled his own blanket over his shoulders, and settled into the chair by the hearth. He didn't sleep much anymore. Hadn't since she'd arrived. He told himself it was because he needed to keep watch, make sure she was breathing, make sure she didn't need anything. But the truth was simpler than that. He didn't trust himself to stop caring if he let his guard down. The next morning, Ayla tried something new. Instead of just standing, she took a step. It wasn't much, barely more than a shuffle. Her weight braced against the wooden frame Colt had built, her legs shaking so hard he thought they'd give out. But it was a step. Colt's breath caught. "Again," he said. Ayla gritted her teeth and dragged her other foot forward. Another step, then another. She made it 3 feet before her knees buckled. Colt caught her, his hands under her arms, and lowered her gently to the floor. She was breathing hard, sweat dripping down her face, but when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright. "I did it," she whispered. "Yeah," Colt said, his voice rough. "You did." She laughed, sharp and breathless, and Colt felt something crack open in his chest. That was the sound he'd been waiting for. Over the next week, Ayla walked a little farther each day. 5 feet, 10, 15. It was slow, agonizing work. Every step looked like it cost her everything she had. But she kept going. Colt built her a pair of crutches, crude things, carved from pine and padded with scraps of leather, and she used them to take some of the weight off the braces. It helped. Not much, but enough. One evening, after a particularly brutal session, Ayla collapsed on the bed and didn't move for 20 minutes. Colt brought her water and sat on the edge of the mattress, watching her. "You're pushing too hard," he said. "Not hard enough. You're going to hurt yourself." "I already hurt." She opened her eyes and looked at him. "You think I do not feel it? Every step, every breath, it hurts. But pain is good. Pain means I am alive." Colt didn't have an answer for that. Ayla sat up slowly, wincing as her muscles protested. "You know what hurts more than pain?" "What?" "Shame." Her voice was quiet, but there was steel in it. "When my people threw me in river, I did not fight, did not scream, because part of me believed them, believed I was burden, believed I should die." She looked down at her hands. "That shame is worse than anything, worse than pain, worse than fear, because it makes you small, makes you nothing." Colt's jaw tightened. "And now?" he asked. "Now I am angry." She met his eyes. "Angry that I believed them. Angry that I let them decide I was worthless. Angry that I almost gave up." She paused. "But I am not small anymore. I am not nothing, and I will walk. Not because I need to, because I choose to." Colt nodded slowly. "Good." Ayla tilted her head. "You are a strange man, Colt. You do not ask for anything, do not expect anything. You just help." "Why?" Colt looked away. "Told you already. Didn't seem right." "That is still not answer." He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't know, Ayla. Maybe I just needed something to fix. Maybe I'm tired of being alone. Maybe I saw you in that river and thought if I could save you, it'd make up for all the times I didn't save anyone else." "You cannot save everyone," Ayla said softly. "Yeah, I know." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling behind them. Finally, Ayla spoke. "When I was child, my grandmother told me story. She said the river is not enemy. River is test. If you fight it, it drowns you. If you let it carry you, it takes you where you need to go." Colt frowned. "You think that river was supposed to bring you here?" "I think maybe." She smiled faintly. "Or maybe I am just lucky you are fool who jumps in rivers." Colt snorted. "Yeah, that sounds about right." 2 days later, Ayla walked across the entire cabin without stopping. It took her 5 minutes. Her legs shook the whole time. She had to lean heavily on the crutches, and by the end, she was gasping for breath. But she made it. Colt stood by the door, watching, his arms crossed over his chest. When she reached the far wall and braced herself against it, she turned and looked at him, her face flushed and triumphant. "See?" she said. "I told you." "Yeah," Colt said quietly. "You did." She laughed, full and unrestrained this time, and Colt couldn't help but smile. For the first time in weeks, he let himself believe that maybe this could actually work. But the desert didn't forgive hope any more than it forgave weakness. 3 days later, Colt was outside chopping wood when he heard Rusty whinny. He looked up and saw them. 4 riders coming up the canyon trail. Apache. Colt's blood went cold. He set the axe down and walked slowly toward the cabin, his eyes never leaving the riders. They were still a quarter-mile out, but he could see them clearly now. Warriors, all of them, armed with rifles and bows. One of them he recognized, the old man, the one who'd given the order to throw Ayla into the river. Colt's hand went to the revolver on his hip. He stepped inside the cabin and found Ayla sitting by the fire, working a piece of leather into a new strap for her braces. She looked up when he entered, saw his face, and went still. "What is wrong?" "Company," Colt said. "Your people." The color drained from her face. "How many?" 4, maybe 5. Ayla's hands clenched around the leather. "They come for me. Probably." She looked down at her legs, her jaw tight. "I cannot run." "I know." "I cannot fight." "I know that too." She met his eyes, and he saw fear there, real, raw fear, but something else too, determination. "What will you do?" she asked. Colt walked to the corner of the room and picked up his rifle. He checked the chamber, made sure it was loaded, then slung it over his shoulder. I'm going to talk to them. And if they do not want to talk? Colt looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, then I'll make sure they don't get past that door. Ayla's breath hitched. You would fight for me? Yeah. Why? Because you're mine to protect now, Colt said simply. And I don't give up what's mine. Ayla stared at him, her eyes wide and shining. Colt turned and walked back outside before she could say anything else. The riders had stopped about 50 yards from the cabin. They sat on their horses, watching, waiting. Colt stepped into the open, his rifle in his hands but not raised. Not yet. The old man dismounted and walked forward. He moved slowly, deliberately, his hands visible and empty. When he was 10 feet away, he stopped. Colt studied him. The man's face was lined and weathered, his eyes sharp and unforgiving. He wore a beaded necklace and a knife at his belt, but no gun. You speak English? Colt asked. The man nodded. Some. Then let's keep this simple. What do you want? The old man's gaze flicked toward the cabin, then back to Colt. The woman. She belongs to us. No, Colt said. She doesn't. We throw her in river. You take her. That is theft. Colt's grip tightened on the rifle. You threw her away. I picked her up. That's not theft. That's common sense. The old man's expression didn't change. She is broken. Cannot walk. Cannot help tribe. We do what is necessary. Necessary, Colt repeated, his voice hard. That what you call it? Leaving a woman to drown because she's not useful anymore? You do not understand our ways. No, Colt said. I don't. And I don't want to. The old man studied him for a long moment. Then he said, You keep her. She will die. You cannot care for her forever. That's my problem, not yours. She is burden to you, just as she was burden to us. Colt's jaw clenched. She's not a burden. She's a person, and she's worth more than you gave her credit for. The old man's eyes narrowed. You think you save her? You think you make her strong? I think she's stronger than you ever knew. For a moment, the old man said nothing. Then he turned and gestured toward the cabin. Show me. Colt hesitated. Then he called over his shoulder. Ayla! The door opened, and Ayla stepped out. She was wearing the braces, leaning on the crutches. Her legs shook, and her face was pale, but she stood upright, her chin lifted. The old man stared at her. So did the other warriors. Ayla took a step forward, then another. Her breathing was labored, her movements slow and awkward, but she kept going. She walked 10 feet, then stopped, her chest heaving, and she looked the old man in the eye. I am not broken, she said, her voice clear and steady. I am not burden. I am alive, and I will walk. The old man's face didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. He turned back to Colt. You teach her this? No, Colt said. She did it herself. I just gave her the chance. The old man was silent for a long time. Then he nodded slowly. You keep her, he said. She is yours now. And with that, he turned and walked back to his horse. The warriors followed. Colt watched them ride away, his heart pounding in his chest. When they were gone, he turned and looked at Ayla. She was still standing, her hands gripping the crutches so hard her knuckles were white. Then her legs gave out, and she fell. Colt caught her before she hit the ground. You did good, he said quietly. Ayla's face was buried against his chest, and he felt her shaking, not from weakness, but from something else entirely. They saw me, she whispered. They saw me walk. Yeah, Colt said. They did. She pulled back and looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. I am not nothing. No, Colt said. You're not. And for the first time since he'd pulled her from the river, Ayla smiled, really smiled, and Colt thought maybe saving her had saved him too. That night, Ayla didn't sleep. She sat by the fire, her legs stretched out in front of her, her hands resting in her lap. Colt sat across from her, whittling a piece of wood into something shapeless, just to keep his hands busy. What will happen now? Ayla asked. Don't know, Colt said. They're gone. That's what matters. But they saw me. They know I can walk. Yeah. What if they come back? They won't. How do you know? Colt set the knife down and looked at her. Because you proved them wrong. And people don't like being wrong. They'll stay away. Ayla nodded slowly, but she didn't look convinced. What are you thinking? Colt asked. I am thinking, I do not know who I am anymore. She looked down at her hands. I was Apache. I was daughter, sister. I was part of tribe. But now, I am nothing. I am no one. You're Ayla, Colt said. That's enough. Is it? Yeah, she met his eyes. And what are you, Colt? You live alone. You do not speak of family, of friends. You are... Ghost. Colt's chest tightened. Maybe. Why? He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, because it's easier. Easier than what? Than caring, than losing. Ayla tilted her head. You lose someone. Everyone loses someone, Colt said. That's just how it works. But you are afraid to lose again. Colt looked away. Yeah, I guess I am. Ayla was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I was afraid too. Afraid to try. Afraid to fail. But you made me believe I could. You made me want to try. Colt's throat tightened. And now I think maybe you need someone to do same for you, Ayla said softly. Colt didn't answer, but he didn't have to, because they both knew she was right. The days that followed were different. Ayla walked more, stronger, longer. She didn't need the crutches as much anymore. The braces still helped, but she was learning to balance without them, learning to trust her legs again. Colt watched her, and every time she stood on her own, every time she took a step without falling, he felt something settle in his chest. Pride, maybe. Or relief. Or something he didn't have a name for yet. One afternoon, Ayla walked all the way to the creek and back without stopping. It took her an hour, and by the time she returned, she was drenched in sweat and trembling with exhaustion. But she'd done it. Colt was waiting for her by the cabin, his arms crossed, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Show off, he said. Ayla grinned. You are jealous. Maybe. She laughed and collapsed onto the bench outside the door. Colt brought her water, and she drank it in long, grateful gulps. I'm getting stronger, she said. Yeah, you are. Soon I will not need braces. Soon. Ayla looked at him, her expression thoughtful. And then what? Colt sat down beside her. What do you mean? When I'm strong again, when I can walk, run, hunt. What happens then? Colt didn't answer right away, because the truth was he didn't know, and he wasn't sure he wanted to. We'll figure it out, he said finally. Ayla smiled faintly. You always say that. Because it's true. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Colt went still. They sat like that for a long time, watching the sun dip below the canyon walls, painting the sky red and gold. And for the first time in years, Colt didn't feel alone. But peace never lasted long in the desert. 2 weeks later, Colt was hunting when he saw smoke on the horizon. It was coming from the direction of the nearest settlement, a small trading post about 15 miles south. Colt frowned and changed course, riding toward it. When he arrived, the post was in ruins. The building had been burned to the ground, the wood still smoldering. Bodies lay scattered in the dirt. 3 men, all of them shot. Colt recognized one of them, a trader named Harlan who sold whiskey and tobacco. Colt dismounted and walked through the wreckage, his rifle in his hands. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. He found tracks leading away from the post. Horses, at least 6 of them, heading north, toward his cabin. Colt's blood ran cold. He mounted Rusty and rode hard, his heart pounding in his chest. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was setting. Everything looked normal, quiet, too quiet. Colt dismounted and approached slowly, his rifle raised. The door was ajar. He pushed it open and stepped inside. Ayla was on the floor, her hands tied behind her back, a gag in her mouth. A man stood over her, white, mid-30s, with a scarred face and a gun in his hand. 3 more men were scattered around the room, rifling through Colt's belongings. The scarred man looked up when Colt entered, and he smiled. Well, well, he said. You must be Colt. Colt's finger moved to the trigger. Let her go. Or what? Or I put a bullet in your skull. The man laughed. You could try, but my boys here might take issue with that. The other men stopped what they were doing and turned toward Colt, their hands moving to their guns. Colt's mind raced. 4 against 1. Bad odds. but he'd faced worse. "What do you want?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Heard you had a woman here," the scarred man said. "Indian. Thought we'd come see for ourselves." "You thought wrong. Leave." "Can't do that." The man crouched down beside Ayla and grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him. "She's a pretty one. Be ashamed to waste her." Ayla's eyes blazed, but she didn't make a sound. Colt's vision went red. "Last chance," he said. "Let her go." The scarred man stood and raised his gun, pointing it at Colt. "I don't think you're in a position to make demands, friend." Colt didn't hesitate. He fired. The bullet hit the scarred man in the chest, and he dropped like a stone. The room exploded into chaos. Colt dove behind the table as the other men opened fire. Bullets splintered the wood, and Colt returned fire, taking down one man, then another. The third man rushed him, and Colt met him head-on. They crashed into the wall, grappling for control of the rifle. Colt drove his knee into the man's gut, then slammed the butt of the rifle into his face. The man went down. Colt turned, breathing hard, and scanned the room. All 4 men were down, dead or dying. Colt dropped the rifle and crossed to Ayla. He pulled the gag from her mouth and cut the ropes binding her wrists. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough. Ayla nodded, her face pale. "Yes, I am okay." Colt pulled her into his arms and she clung to him, her whole body shaking. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have been here." "You are here now," Ayla whispered. "That is enough." Colt held her for a long time, his heart still racing, his hands still trembling. And he made a decision. He couldn't protect her here. Not anymore. The world was too dangerous, too violent, but he wasn't letting her go. Not now. Not ever. They buried the bodies at dawn. Colt didn't want them near the cabin, so he dragged them a quarter-mile out and dug shallow graves in the hard ground. It took hours. His shoulders burned, his hands blistered, but he kept digging until all 4 men were covered. Ayla watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame. She didn't offer to help, couldn't really. But she didn't look away either. When Colt finally came back, his shirt soaked through with sweat, she handed him water without a word. He drank it down and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "You think more will come?" Ayla asked. "Maybe." "Then we should leave." Colt looked at her. "You want to leave?" "I want to be safe. Here is not safe." She was right. He knew she was right. But leaving meant giving up the only place he'd ever called his own. The cabin, the canyon, the quiet. It was all he had. Except now he had her, and that changed everything. "Where would we go?" he asked. Ayla shrugged. "Anywhere. Nowhere. Does it matter?" "Yeah, it matters." She stepped closer, her eyes serious. "Colt, those men came here because they heard about me. Because people talk. Because you cannot hide woman in middle of nowhere without someone noticing." She paused. "If we stay, more will come. And next time, maybe you do not win." Colt's jaw tightened. "I can handle it. I know you can. But should you have to?" He didn't have an answer for that. Ayla touched his arm, her hand warm against his skin. "I do not want you to die for me. I'm not planning on it." "Plans do not matter when bullets fly." Colt looked down at her hand, then back at her face. "If we leave, you'll have to walk. A long way. You strong enough for that?" Ayla's chin lifted. "Yes." "You sure?" "I walked a creek and back. I can walk farther." Colt studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, we leave in 3 days. That'll give you time to rest and me time to pack." Ayla's expression softened. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. This is going to be hard." "I know," she said, "but hard is better than dead." Colt almost smiled. "Yeah, I guess it is." The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Colt packed what they'd need: bedrolls, dried meat, ammunition, a water skin, his rifle, a knife, flint, and steel. He left most of his belongings behind: the chair he'd built, the table, the extra blankets. They couldn't carry much, and he wasn't sentimental about things. Ayla worked on strengthening her legs. She walked laps around the cabin, pushing herself harder than before. By the second day, she could make it 100 yards without the crutches. By the third, she was walking almost normally, though her gait was still uneven, and her legs still shook after too much exertion. Colt watched her from the corner of his eye, equal parts impressed and worried. She was tough, tougher than anyone he'd ever met. But toughness had limits. and he didn't know what those limits were yet. On the last night they sat by the fire, neither of them saying much. The cabin felt smaller somehow, like it was already a memory. "You ever been to California?" Colt asked. Ayla shook her head. "No, never been anywhere but here." "Me neither. But I heard it's different, warmer, more people." "You think we go there?" "Maybe, or maybe we go north, Colorado, Wyoming, plenty of places to disappear." Ayla looked at him. "You want to disappear, don't you?" She thought about it. "I want to be free, to go where I want, to not be afraid." She paused. "Is that same as disappearing?" "Close enough." Ayla smiled faintly. "Then yes, I want to disappear." They sat in silence for a while longer. Then Ayla said, "Colt, when we leave, what happens to us?" "What do you mean? Are we together? Or do we go separate ways when it is safe?" Colt's chest tightened. He hadn't thought about that, hadn't let himself. "You want to go separate ways?" he asked carefully. Ayla's gaze dropped to her hands. "I do not know. I do not know what I want. I only know that I do not want to be alone again." "You won't be," Colt said. "Not if I can help it." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "You promise?" "Yeah, I promise." Ayla nodded slowly, and something in her expression eased. Colt didn't know if he could keep that promise, didn't know what the future held, or if they'd even survive the next few weeks. But he meant it, and that was enough for now. They left at first light. Colt saddled Rusty and loaded their supplies onto the horse's back. Ayla stood beside him, wearing a pair of pants Colt had traded for months ago and a shirt she'd patched herself. Her hair was braided down her back, and she carried a walking stick Colt had carved for her. She looked different, stronger, like someone who could survive anything. Colt hoped that was true. He helped her onto Rusty, then swung up behind her. The horse shifted under their combined weight, but didn't protest. Colt took one last look at the cabin. It wasn't much, just 4 walls and a roof, but it had been his. Then he turned Rusty toward the trail and kicked the horse into motion. They didn't look back. What? The first 2 days were rough. They traveled slowly, stopping every few hours so Ayla could rest. Her legs held up better than Colt expected, but he could see the strain in her face, the way she gritted her teeth when she thought he wasn't looking. They camped in the open, under the stars, and Colt kept watch while Ayla slept. He didn't mind. Sleep had never come easy to him anyway. On the 3rd day, they reached a small town called Red Bluff. It wasn't much, just a handful of buildings clustered around a dirt road, a general store, a saloon, and a livery. But it had people, and people meant supplies. Colt tied Rusty outside the general store and helped Ayla down. She was limping now, favoring her left leg, but she didn't complain. "Stay close," Colt said. "I am not child." "I know, just stay close anyway." Ayla rolled her eyes, but she stayed beside him as they walked inside. The store was dim and cluttered, shelves stacked with canned goods, bolts of fabric, tools, and ammunition. An old man sat behind the counter reading a newspaper. He looked up when they entered, his eyes narrowing. "Help you?" he asked. "Need supplies," Colt said. "Flour, salt, coffee, whatever you've got." The old man's gaze flicked to Ayla, lingered there for a moment, then returned to Colt. "That'll be $2. Colt pulled out a few coins and set them on the counter. The old man counted them, then nodded and started gathering the supplies. Ayla wandered toward the back of the store, her hand trailing over a stack of blankets. Colt watched her out of the corner of his eye, making sure she was all right. The old man cleared his throat. "She your wife?" Colt's jaw tightened. "No. Indian, ain't she?" "Yeah," the old man grunted. "Didn't know folks around here took kindly to that sort of thing." "They don't," Colt said flatly. "That's why we're leaving." The old man didn't say anything else, just handed Colt the supplies and took his money. Colt and Ayla left without another word. They made camp a few miles outside of town, near a creek that ran clear and cold. Ayla washed her face and hands in the water while Colt built a fire. "That man in store," Ayla said. "He did not like me." "No," Colt said. "He didn't." "Because I am Apache?" "Yeah." Ayla was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is it always like this? People staring, people judging?" "Probably." "Does it bother you?" Colt looked at her. Does it bother you? Yes, Ayla admitted. But I do not care what they think. I only care what you think. Colt's throat tightened. I think you're the strongest person I've ever met, and I think anyone who can't see that is a damn fool. Ayla smiled, and the weight in Colt's chest eased a little. They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them. When they were done, Ayla leaned back against a rock and stared up at the sky. You ever think about what comes next? She asked. All the time. And what do you see? Colt thought about it. Honestly, I don't know. I've spent so long just trying to survive, I never thought past that. And now? Now I think maybe surviving isn't enough. He looked at her. Maybe there's more to it than that. Ayla met his gaze, and something passed between them, something quiet and unspoken, but real. I think so too, she said softly. They traveled for 2 more weeks, moving north through the desert and into the foothills. The landscape changed as they went. Less red rock, more pine trees, cooler air. Ayla's legs grew stronger with each passing day. She didn't need the walking stick as much anymore, and she could keep pace with Colt without stopping every hour. But the farther they went, the more Colt felt the weight of what they were doing. They were running. And running only worked for so long. One night, camped near a ridge overlooking a valley, Ayla asked him the question he'd been dreading. What are we running from, Colt? He didn't answer right away. People, he said finally. The world. Everything. That is a lot to run from. Yeah. Ayla pulled her knees to her chest and stared into the fire. What if we stop running? Then what? Then we find a place where we do not have to be afraid, where we can just be. Colt looked at her. You think that place exists? I do not know, but I want to find out. Colt nodded slowly. All right. Then we keep going until we do. Ayla smiled, and Colt felt something settle in his chest. Maybe they wouldn't find that place. Maybe it didn't exist. But for the first time in his life, Colt thought it might be worth trying. A week later, they reached a town called Silver Creek. It was bigger than Red Bluff. 2 streets, a dozen buildings, a church, a schoolhouse. People moved through the streets, going about their business, and Colt felt the familiar prickle of unease. He didn't like towns, too many people, too many eyes. But they needed supplies, and Rusty needed rest. They found a boarding house on the edge of town and paid for a room. The woman who ran the place, a stout, gray-haired woman with sharp eyes, looked at Ayla with suspicion but didn't say anything. Colt and Ayla ate dinner in the small dining room downstairs, surrounded by strangers. No one spoke to them. A few people stared. Colt ignored them. After dinner, they went upstairs to their room. It was small and plain, just a bed, a washstand, and a chair, but it felt like luxury after weeks of sleeping on the ground. Ayla sat on the edge of the bed, her shoulders sagging with exhaustion. You okay? Colt asked. Tired, she said. But okay. Colt nodded and turned to leave. Where are you going? Gonna sleep in the chair, give you some space. Ayla frowned. That is stupid. Bed is big enough for both. Colt hesitated. You sure? Yes, I am sure. He crossed the room and sat on the opposite side of the bed, keeping a respectful distance between them. They lay there in silence for a while, the sounds of the town filtering through the thin walls. Colt? Ayla said quietly. Yeah? Thank you for everything. Colt didn't know what to say to that, so he just said, You're welcome. Ayla turned onto her side, facing him. I mean it. You saved my life more than once, and you did not have to. I wanted to. Why? Colt thought about it. Because you deserved a chance, and because, I don't know. Maybe I needed to save someone. Maybe I needed you to save me. Ayla's eyes shone in the dim light. You think I saved you? Yeah, Colt said. I do. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his. They fell asleep like that, holding on to each other in the dark. Ishkin. The next morning, Colt woke to the sound of shouting outside. He sat up, his hand going instinctively to the gun on the nightstand. Ayla stirred beside him, her eyes opening. What is it? She asked. Don't know. Stay here. Colt crossed to the window and looked out. A crowd had gathered in the street below. Men, mostly, armed with rifles and shotguns. They were surrounding a building, the saloon, by the look of it, and someone inside was shouting back. Colt's gut tightened. This wasn't good. He turned to Ayla. Get dressed. We're leaving. What is happening? Trouble, and I don't want to be here when it gets worse. They packed quickly and slipped out the back door of the boarding house. Colt led Rusty through the alley, keeping to the shadows, his eyes on the crowd. They were almost clear when someone shouted. Hey, you there! Colt cursed under his breath and kept moving. I said stop! A gunshot cracked through the air, and Colt's blood went cold. He turned and saw a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with a sheriff's badge pinned to his chest, striding toward them. Where do you think you're going? The sheriff demanded. Nowhere, Colt said, just passing through. The sheriff's eyes flicked to Ayla, and his expression hardened. That your woman? Yeah. She Indian? Yeah. The sheriff spat into the dirt. We don't take kindly to that here. Colt's hand moved toward his gun. We're leaving, no trouble. Too late for that. The sheriff raised his rifle. You're coming with me. Colt didn't think. He drew his gun and fired. The bullet hit the sheriff in the shoulder, spinning him around. He dropped his rifle and stumbled back, clutching his arm. The crowd erupted. Colt grabbed Ayla's hand and ran. They made it to Rusty, and Colt hauled Ayla onto the horse's back before swinging up behind her. He kicked the horse hard, and Rusty bolted forward. Gunfire exploded behind them, bullets whizzing past their heads. Colt kept his head down, his arms wrapped around Ayla, his heart pounding in his chest. They rode hard, not stopping until the town was miles behind them. When they finally slowed, Ayla turned in the saddle and looked at him. You shot Sheriff, she said, her eyes wide. Yeah. They will come after us. I know. Ayla's face was pale, but her voice was steady. Then we keep running. Colt nodded. Yeah, we keep running. We'll see them. They rode for 3 days straight, stopping only when Rusty couldn't go any farther. Colt kept expecting to hear hoofbeats behind them, to see a posse cresting the ridge, but they stayed alone. On the 4th day, they reached the mountains. The air was cooler here, the trees thicker. It felt safer somehow, like the world couldn't reach them. They made camp in a clearing beside a stream, and for the first time in days, Colt let himself breathe. Ayla sat on a rock, soaking her feet in the cold water. Her legs were trembling, her face drawn with exhaustion, but she didn't complain. You okay? Colt asked. I will be. Colt sat beside her and stared out at the mountains. I'm sorry for all of this. Why are you sorry? Because you shouldn't have to run. You shouldn't have to live like this. Ayla looked at him. And what should I do? Go back to people who threw me away? Stay in town where people hate me? She shook her head. No, I choose this. I choose you, and I do not regret it. Colt's throat tightened. You might. Someday. Maybe, Ayla said, but not today. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and Colt wrapped his arm around her. They sat like that for a long time, the sound of the stream filling the silence. And for the first time since they'd left the cabin, Colt thought maybe, just maybe, they'd be all right. That night, as they lay by the fire, Ayla asked him a question. Colt, do you think we will ever stop running? Colt stared up at the stars. I don't know. Maybe. What would that look like? A place where no one knows us, where we can start over, build something. Like cabin? Yeah, like that. Ayla was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I would like that. Yeah, Colt said. Me too. He reached for her hand and she took it. They didn't say anything else. Didn't need to. Because sometimes the best promises were the ones you didn't have to speak out loud. They found the valley 3 weeks later. It wasn't what Colt had imagined, wasn't green and lush like the stories people told about California, wasn't flat and easy. It was narrow and rocky, carved between 2 steep ridges, with a creek running through the center and pine trees clustered thick on the slopes. The soil looked hard, the winters would be brutal, and the nearest town was probably 2 days' ride. It was perfect. Colt reined Rusty to a stop at the mouth of the valley and sat there, taking it in. Ayla leaned against his back, her arms wrapped around his waist, her breathing steady. What do you think? He asked. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, I think it is ours. Colt felt something settle in his chest. Yeah, I think so too. They rode down into the valley and made camp near the creek. Rusty drank deeply from the water, and Colt unloaded their supplies while Ayla walked the perimeter, testing her legs, getting a feel for the place. She moved differently now. Still careful, still deliberate, but stronger. Her limp was barely noticeable unless you knew to look for it. The braces were gone. She'd discarded them a week ago, said she didn't need them anymore. Colt had kept them anyway, tied to Rusty's saddle, just in case. But she hadn't asked for them once. That night, they sat by the fire and talked about what came next. "We will need shelter," Ayla said. "Winter comes early in mountains." "Yeah, I'll start cutting timber tomorrow. Build something small first, then add on as we go." "I can help." Colt looked at her. "You sure?" "I am not useless, Colt." "Didn't say you were." "Then stop treating me like I will break." Colt held up his hands. "All right, you can help." Ayla smiled, satisfied, and took another bite of the rabbit they'd roasted over the fire. Colt watched her in the firelight, and something shifted in him. She'd changed since that first day he'd pulled her from the river. Hell, they both had. He didn't know what they were to each other, didn't have words for it, didn't think he needed them. But he knew he didn't want to do this without her. "Ayla," he said. "Yes? You ever think about going back?" She looked at him, her expression serious. "To my people?" "Yeah, no." Her voice was firm. "They made choice. I made mine. I do not belong there anymore." "Where do you belong?" Ayla's gaze held his. "Here, with you." Colt's throat tightened. He nodded, not trusting his voice. Ayla reached across the fire and took his hand. Her palm was rough, calloused from weeks of hard travel, but warm. "You saved my life," she said quietly. "Now I want to live it, with you, if you will have me." Colt squeezed her hand. "Yeah, I'll have you." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Colt think maybe they'd actually pulled this off. Maybe they'd actually found something worth keeping. They stayed up late that night, talking about plans and dreams and all the things they'd build together. And when they finally fell asleep, curled up beside the fire, Colt slept better than he had in years. Tipua. The work started the next day. Colt cut timber while Ayla gathered stones from the creek bed. It was slow, backbreaking work. And by the end of the first week, they'd only managed to clear a foundation and stack enough logs for one wall. But it was theirs. Ayla worked as hard as Colt did, maybe harder. She hauled stones, stripped bark, mixed mud for chinking. Her hands blistered, her back ached, but she never complained. And when Colt tried to tell her to rest, she just gave him a look that said she'd rest when she was damn well ready. Colt learned not to argue. One afternoon, while they were taking a break by the creek, Ayla asked him about his family. "You never talk about them," she said. "Your mother, your father." Colt looked down at the water. "Not much to talk about." "They're dead?" "Yeah, my father died when I was 12. Fever. My mother remarried a year later, man named Dutch. He was not good." "He hurt you?" "He hurt her," Colt said quietly. "I tried to stop him once. He broke 2 of my ribs and told me if I ever tried again, he'd kill me." Ayla's face went hard. "What did you do?" "Left. Soon as I was old enough. Never went back." "And your mother?" Colt's jaw tightened. "She died a few years later. Pneumonia," they said. "But I think she just gave up." Ayla reached out and touched his arm. "I am sorry. It was a long time ago. Does not make it hurt less." Colt looked at her surprised. "No, it doesn't." They sat in silence for a while, the sound of the creek filling the space between them. Finally, Ayla said, "My mother died when I was born. My father raised me, but he did not know what to do with daughter. He wanted son, someone strong, someone who could hunt, fight. I tried to be that for him, tried so hard." Her voice cracked. "But I was never enough." "That's not true." "It is," Ayla said. "When I fell from horse and could not walk, he looked at me like I had failed him, like I was disappointment. And when tribe decided to throw me in river, he did not stop them. He just let them." Colt's hands curled into fists. "He was wrong. Maybe. But it does not change what happened." "No," Colt said. "But you're here now. And you're alive. And you're stronger than any of them ever gave you credit for." Ayla looked at him, her eyes shining. "You really believe that?" "Yeah, I do." She leaned her head against his shoulder and Colt wrapped his arm around her. They stayed like that until the sun started to set, and then they went back to work. By the end of the second week, they had 3 walls. By the end of the third, they had a roof. It wasn't much, just a single room, barely big enough for the 2 of them, with gaps in the walls that would need chinking before winter. But it was shelter. It was home. The first night they slept inside, Ayla lay on the floor wrapped in a blanket and stared up at the ceiling. "We did it," she said, her voice full of wonder. "Yeah," Colt said. "We did." She turned to look at him. "You know what this means?" "What?" "We are not running anymore." Colt thought about that. She was right. For the first time since they'd left the cabin, they weren't looking over their shoulders, weren't moving from place to place. They were staying. "How's it feel?" he asked. Ayla smiled. "Terrifying." Colt laughed. "Yeah, me too." The peace lasted 2 more weeks. Colt was out hunting one afternoon when he saw the smoke. It was coming from the direction of the valley, thin and gray against the sky. His gut tightened. He kicked Rusty into a run, his rifle clutched tight in his hands. When he reached the cabin, Ayla was standing outside, her face pale, a burning torch in her hand. "What the hell are you doing?" Colt shouted, swinging down from the saddle. Ayla turned to him, her eyes fierce. "Someone was here." Colt's blood went cold. "What?" "I heard them. In the trees, watching." She gestured toward the forest. "I went to look, and I found this." She held up a piece of cloth, ragged and dirty, with a symbol stitched into the corner. Colt recognized it immediately. It was the same symbol the men who'd attacked the cabin had worn. "Damn it," Colt muttered. "They followed us," Ayla said, her voice tight. "They know we are here." "How many?" "I do not know. I only heard one, maybe 2. Colt scanned the tree line, his hand on his gun. "You sure they're gone?" "For now." Colt cursed under his breath and turned to the cabin. The smoke was coming from a small pile of brush Ayla had set alight near the door, probably to scare off whoever had been watching. "Put that out," he said. "We don't need to give them a signal." Ayla stomped out the fire, and Colt went inside. He checked their supplies, made sure the rifle was loaded, and secured the door as best he could. When he came back out, Ayla was sitting on a stump, her arms wrapped around herself. "What do we do?" she asked. "We wait," Colt said. "See if they come back. And if they do, then we fight." Ayla looked at him, her jaw set. "I am not afraid to fight." "I know. But I do not want to lose this." She gestured to the cabin, to the valley, to everything they'd built. "I do not want to run again." "We won't," Colt said. "Not this time." They didn't have to wait long. The men came at dawn. Colt was awake when he heard the horses, 3 of them, maybe 4, moving through the trees. He woke Ayla with a hand over her mouth and a finger to his lips. She nodded, wide-eyed, and grabbed the knife he'd given her. Colt moved to the door and cracked it open, peering out. 4 men, all armed, all moving toward the cabin. Colt recognized the one in front, a wiry man with a scar running down his cheek. He'd been at the trading post, one of the group that had burned it down. Colt's hand tightened on his rifle. The men stopped about 20 yards out and dismounted. The scarred man stepped forward, his hands raised. "We don't want trouble," he called. "We just want to talk." Colt pushed the door open and stepped outside, his rifle leveled. "Then talk." The scarred man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Name's Pike. Heard you shot a sheriff back in Silver Creek." He had it coming. Maybe. But that kind of thing draws attention. Makes people curious. Pike's gaze flicked to the cabin, then back to Colt. "Heard you got a woman with you. Indian woman. That true?" Colt's jaw tightened. "What's it to you?" "Nothing. Just making conversation." Pike took a step closer. "Thing is, friend, you're on land that don't belong to you, and we don't take kindly to squatters. This land doesn't belong to anyone." "It does now," Pike said. "We're claiming it, so you've got 2 choices. You can leave, or you can die." Colt didn't hesitate. He fired. The bullet hit Pike in the leg and he went down screaming. The other men scattered, diving for cover, and gunfire erupted. Colt ducked back inside and slammed the door. Bullets punched through the walls, splintering the wood, and Ayla dropped to the floor, her hands over her head. "Stay down!" Colt shouted. He moved to the window and returned fire, taking down one of the men. The other 2 kept shooting, and Colt heard Pike yelling orders from somewhere outside. "Burn them out!" Colt's stomach dropped. He turned to Ayla. "We need to go. Now." She nodded and crawled toward the back wall. Colt grabbed their supplies, what little they could carry, and kicked open the rear door. Smoke was already rising from the front of the cabin, thick and black. They ran. Colt heard shouting behind them, heard gunfire, but he didn't stop. He grabbed Ayla's hand and pulled her into the trees, his lungs burning, his heart pounding. They made it to the creek and splashed across, the cold water soaking their boots. Colt kept moving, kept pulling Ayla along until they were deep in the forest and the sounds of the men had faded. Finally, he stopped and turned to her. "You okay?" Ayla nodded, gasping for breath. "Yes, I am okay." Colt looked back toward the valley where smoke was rising into the sky. Their cabin was gone. Everything they'd built, everything they'd worked for, gone. Colt sank to his knees, his chest heaving, his hands shaking. Ayla knelt beside him and wrapped her arms around him. "We will rebuild," she said fiercely. "We will start again." Colt shook his head. "I'm tired, Ayla. I'm tired of running, tired of fighting, tired of losing." "I know," she said, "but we are not dead. And as long as we are alive, we can fight." Colt looked at her and saw the fire in her eyes, the strength that had kept her going through everything. And he realized something. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. Colt stood and pulled her to her feet. "All right," he said. "We fight." Ayla smiled. "Good." They circled back toward the valley, moving carefully through the trees. The men were still there. Colt could see them through the smoke, standing near the ruins of the cabin, laughing and drinking from a bottle they'd pulled from somewhere. Pike was sitting on the ground, his leg wrapped in a bloody bandage, barking orders. Colt counted them. 3 left, including Pike. Not great odds, but better than 4. He turned to Ayla. "You stay here." "No." "Ayla." "No," she said again, her voice firm. "We fight together, or we do not fight at all." Colt looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, together." He handed her the knife. "You know how to use this?" "Yes." "Good. Stay behind me, and if something goes wrong, you run. You hear me?" "I hear you." Colt took a deep breath and stepped out of the trees. The men saw him immediately. One of them raised his rifle, but Colt was faster. He fired, and the man dropped. The other 2 scrambled for their guns, but Ayla was already moving. She came out of the trees like a shadow, fast and silent, and drove the knife into the second man's side before he even saw her coming. He screamed and fell, clutching the wound. The third man turned and fired wildly, missing Colt by inches. Colt returned fire, hitting him in the chest, and he went down hard. Pike tried to stand, tried to run, but his injured leg gave out and he collapsed. Colt walked over and stood above him, his rifle pointed at Pike's head. "You made a mistake," Colt said. Pike spat blood and glared up at him. "You're dead. You hear me? They'll come for you. They'll burn everything you—" Colt pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed through the valley, and then there was silence. Colt lowered the rifle and turned to Ayla. She was standing over the man she'd stabbed, the knife still in her hand, her chest heaving. "You okay?" Colt asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes, I am okay." Colt walked over and took the knife from her hand. She was trembling, and he pulled her into his arms. "It's over," he said. "Is it?" Ayla asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "Will they keep coming? Will we always have to fight?" Colt didn't have an answer for that, because the truth was, he didn't know. But he knew one thing. He wasn't running anymore, and neither was she. They buried the bodies far from the cabin and spent the rest of the day salvaging what they could from the ruins. Most of it was gone. The roof had caved in, the walls were charred and broken, but they found a few things. A pot, a blanket. The braces Colt had built for Ayla, scorched but intact. Ayla picked them up and stared at them for a long moment. "I do not need these anymore," she said. "I know." She set them down gently, like she was saying goodbye to something. Then she turned to Colt. "We rebuild, bigger, stronger, so no one can burn it down again." Colt looked at her and felt something shift in his chest. She wasn't broken. She never had been. She just needed someone to see her the way she really was. And now, standing in the ruins of everything they'd lost, Colt realized something else. He needed her too. Not to save, not to protect, but to stand beside, to fight with, to live with. "Yeah," Colt said. "We rebuild." Ayla smiled, and they got to work. It took them a month to build the new cabin. This time they built it with stone. Thick walls, a strong roof, a door that could be barred from the inside. It was twice the size of the first one, with a fireplace that actually drew properly and windows that let in light. They didn't talk much while they worked. Didn't need to. But every night, when they sat by the fire and ate dinner, Colt felt the weight of the day lift just a little. And every morning, when he woke up beside Ayla, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace. One evening, after they'd finished the last wall, Ayla stood in the doorway and looked out at the valley. "This is ours," she said softly. "No one can take it from us." Colt stood beside her. "No, they can't." She turned to him, her eyes serious. "Do you ever regret it? Pulling me from river?" "No," Colt said without hesitation. "Not once." "Not even when we lost everything?" "We didn't lose everything," Colt said. "We lost a building, but we still have this." He gestured to the valley, to the cabin, to the life they were building. "And we still have each other." Ayla's eyes filled with tears, and she threw her arms around him. Colt held her tight, his face buried in her hair, and let himself believe, really believe, that they were going to be okay. Winter came early that year. The snow started in October and didn't stop until March. Colt and Ayla spent most of those months inside, huddled by the fire, rationing their supplies and telling each other stories to pass the time. It was hard, cold, isolating, but they made it through. And when spring finally arrived, when the snow melted and the valley turned green, Colt and Ayla stepped outside and breathed in the fresh air. "We did it," Ayla said, her voice full of wonder. "Yeah," Colt said. "We did." She turned to him, her face glowing in the sunlight. "What do we do now?" Colt thought about it. Then he smiled. "Whatever we want." Ayla laughed, bright and free, and Colt felt something settle in his chest. They'd survived. And now, finally, they could live. Spring turned to summer, and the valley bloomed. Wildflowers erupted across the meadow, purple lupine, yellow arnica, white columbine. The creek ran high and cold with snowmelt, and deer came down from the ridges to graze in the early mornings. Colt and Ayla planted a garden near the cabin, potatoes, squash, beans, and watched it grow with the kind of quiet satisfaction that only comes from making something with your own hands. Life became routine. Simple. The kind of simple Colt had spent years running from, only to realize it was what he'd been looking for all along. Every morning he woke before dawn and checked the trapline he'd set along the creek. Every afternoon, Ayla worked the garden or mended clothes or practiced walking the ridgeline, testing her strength. Every evening, they sat by the fire and talked about nothing and everything. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. Ayla's legs still ached when the weather turned cold. Colt still woke sometimes in the middle of the night, reaching for his rifle, convinced he heard horses approaching. They argued over stupid things, how to stack firewood, whether to salt the venison before or after drying it, whose turn it was to haul water. But they figured it out. Always. Because that's what you did when you decided to build a life with someone. You figured it out. One evening in late June, while they were sitting outside watching the sun set behind the western ridge, Ayla asked him a question that caught him off guard. "Do you ever think about future?" Colt looked at her. "What do you mean? We're living it." "No, I mean farther. What happens when we are old, when we cannot work like this anymore?" Colt hadn't thought about it. Hadn't let himself. The future had always felt like something that happened to other people, people who had families, who had roots, who weren't just trying to survive day by day. "I don't know," he admitted. "Never made it that far in my head." Ayla was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want children." Colt's breath caught. He turned to look at her, and she was staring at the horizon, her expression calm but serious. "Someday," she continued, "not now, but someday. I want to have children. I want to teach them to be strong, to be kind, to know that they are not defined by what others think of them." She looked at him. "Is that something you want?" Colt's throat tightened. He'd never thought about being a father. The idea seemed impossible, too big, too foreign. He'd spent his whole life alone, and even now, with Ayla beside him, part of him still couldn't believe this was real. But when he imagined it, a child with Ayla's eyes, her stubborn courage, running through the valley and laughing, something in his chest warmed. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think it is." Ayla smiled, and the tension in her shoulders eased. Good. They didn't talk about it again that night, but the idea settled between them, quiet and unspoken, like a seed planted in good soil. The trouble came in August. Colt was hunting in the high country when he saw the riders. There were 5 of them, moving through the trees about a mile south of the valley. They weren't Apache. Colt could tell by the way they sat their horses, the way they moved. White men. Probably drifters. Or worse. Colt's gut tightened. He crouched low behind a boulder and watched them pass, his hand on his rifle. They didn't see him, but they were headed in the direction of the valley. Colt waited until they were out of sight, then turned and ran. He made it back to the cabin in half the time it should have taken, his lungs burning, his legs screaming. Ayla was outside, hanging laundry on a line they'd strung between two trees. She saw his face and dropped the shirt she was holding. "What is wrong?" "Riders," Colt said, gasping for breath. 5 of them, coming this way. Ayla's face went pale. "When?" "Maybe an hour. Maybe less." She didn't hesitate. She turned and ran inside, and Colt followed. They worked fast. Colt loaded every gun they had, the rifle, the revolver, an old shotgun he'd traded for in a town they'd passed through months ago. Ayla filled a sack with ammunition and set it by the door. Then she grabbed the knife Colt had given her and tucked it into her belt. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "We wait," Colt said. "See what they want. Maybe they're just passing through. And if they are not, then we make sure they don't leave." Ayla nodded, her jaw set. Colt went to the window and peered out, scanning the tree line. Nothing yet. But they were coming. He could feel it. "Ayla," he said, not turning around. "Yes?" "If this goes bad, if I tell you to run, you run. You don't look back. You don't wait for me. You just go. I will not leave you." "You will if I tell you to." Ayla crossed the room and grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her. "We fight together, or we do not fight at all. That is what we agreed." Colt stared at her and saw the same fire he'd seen the day she'd walked across the cabin for the first time, the same strength that had kept her alive when everyone else had given up on her. "All right," he said. "Together." The riders appeared 20 minutes later. They came down the main trail into the valley, moving slow and deliberate, their rifles visible across their saddles. Colt watched them from the window, his heart pounding. They stopped about 50 yards from the cabin and dismounted. The leader was a tall man with a gray beard and a scar running from his temple to his jaw. He wore a long coat despite the summer heat, and he carried himself like someone who'd done this before. Colt stepped outside, his rifle in his hands. The man raised his hands in a gesture that was probably meant to be friendly. "Easy, friend. We're not looking for trouble." "Then keep riding," Colt said. The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Can't do that. We've been tracking someone. Man who killed a sheriff down in Silver Creek. Figured we'd find him up here." Colt's grip tightened on the rifle. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do." The man took a step forward. "Sheriff's name was Taggart. You shot him in the shoulder and ran. Left a whole town in an uproar. There's a bounty on your head now. $500. Colt's stomach dropped. $500 was enough to make men do stupid things, dangerous things. "I didn't kill him," Colt said. "I shot him, yeah. But he's not dead." "Maybe not. But you're still wanted, and we're here to collect. You're not lawmen." The man laughed. "No, we're not. But we don't need to be. Just need to bring you in, dead or alive." Colt's finger moved to the trigger. "Then you better make your move." The man's smile faded. "You really want to do this? 5 against 1? 2, Ayla said, stepping out of the cabin. She stood beside Colt, the knife in her hand, her face hard. The bounty hunters stared at her, and one of them laughed. "You're going to let a crippled Indian woman fight your battles?" Ayla's eyes blazed. "I am not crippled, and I am not afraid of you." The man with the scar looked between them, weighing his options. Then he shrugged. "Your funeral." He reached for his gun. Colt didn't give him the chance. He fired, and the man went down. The other hunters scattered, diving for cover, and the valley erupted into gunfire. Colt dropped behind the woodpile and returned fire, taking down another man. Ayla ran to the side of the cabin and crouched low, waiting. One of the hunters broke from cover and rushed toward her. Ayla waited until he was close, then drove the knife into his gut and twisted. The man screamed and fell, clutching the wound. Colt fired again, hitting another hunter in the chest. That left one. The last man stood and raised his hands, his face pale. "Don't shoot! I'm done!" Colt kept the rifle trained on him. "Drop your gun." The man did, kicking it away. "Now get on your horse and ride," Colt said. "And if I ever see you again, I'll kill you." The man didn't need to be told twice. He mounted his horse and rode hard out of the valley, disappearing into the trees. Colt lowered the rifle and turned to Ayla. She was standing over the man she'd stabbed, her chest heaving, blood on her hands. Colt crossed to her and pulled her into his arms. "You okay?" She nodded against his chest. "Yes, I am okay." Colt held her for a long moment, his heart still racing. Then he pulled back and looked at her. "We can't stay here." Ayla's eyes widened. "What?" "That man's going to tell people where we are, and more will come. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll come." "So we run again?" Ayla's voice was sharp with frustration. "We leave everything we built?" "No," Colt said. "We don't run. We move. There's a difference." "Where would we go?" Colt thought about it. "North, Canada, maybe. Somewhere the bounty doesn't reach. Somewhere we can disappear for good." Ayla looked back at the cabin, at the garden, at the valley they'd fought so hard to keep. "I do not want to leave," she said quietly. "I know, but we don't have a choice." Ayla closed her eyes, and for a moment, Colt thought she might argue, thought she might refuse. But then she nodded. "All right, we go." They left the next morning. Colt packed what they could carry: food, blankets, ammunition, a few tools. The rest they left behind: the cabin, the garden, the life they'd built. It hurt more than Colt expected. He'd never been sentimental about places. But this one was different. This one was theirs. Ayla stood in the doorway for a long time, her hand on the frame, her face unreadable. "I want to come back," she said finally. "Someday. When it is safe." "We will," Colt promised. She turned to look at him. "You think that day will come?" "I don't know, but I know we'll be together, and that's enough." Ayla nodded, and they walked away from the cabin without looking back. The journey north took weeks. They traveled through forests and over mountains, following rivers and game trails, avoiding towns and people. Rusty carried their supplies, and they walked most of the way, Ayla's legs growing stronger with each mile. It was hard, exhausting. There were days when they barely spoke, when the weight of everything they'd left behind pressed down on them like a stone. But they kept moving. One evening, camped beside a lake that reflected the stars like glass, Ayla asked Colt a question. "Do you ever regret it? All of this?" Colt looked at her. "Regret what?" "Saving me, fighting for me, losing everything because of me." Colt set down the stick he'd been whittling and moved closer to her. "I didn't lose everything. I found something." "What?" "You," Colt said simply. "I found you. And yeah, it's been hard. Yeah, we've lost things, but I'd do it again, every time." Ayla's eyes filled with tears. "Why?" "Because you made me remember what it feels like to care about something, to fight for something, to live for something." He took her hand. "Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. But you changed that." Ayla's tears spilled over, and she leaned her forehead against his. "You changed me too." They stayed like that for a long time, holding each other under the stars. And Colt realized something. It didn't matter where they went. Didn't matter if they ever made it to Canada or if the bounty followed them for the rest of their lives. Because they had each other. And that was worth more than any piece of land, any cabin, any place they could call home. But they crossed into Canada in early October. The air was colder here, the trees different, the landscape unfamiliar. But it felt safer, quieter. They found a small settlement near a river, just a handful of buildings, a trading post, a few families scratching out a living in the wilderness. The people there didn't ask questions, didn't care where Colt and Ayla had come from or why. They traded work for supplies and found a piece of land a few miles upriver. It wasn't much, just a clearing in the woods with a view of the water and enough timber to build a cabin. It felt like starting over. And maybe it was. But this time it felt different. This time they weren't running. They were choosing. Colt started cutting timber the next day. Ayla helped, and together they built a foundation, then walls, then a roof. It took longer than it should have. Winter came early, and they had to work through snow and freezing rain, but they finished it. And when they finally stepped inside, when they stood in the center of the room and looked around at what they'd built, Colt felt something settle in his chest. This was home. Not because of the place, but because of the person standing beside him. Winter passed and spring came again. Ayla's belly started to swell in March. Colt noticed it one morning when she was getting dressed, the curve of her stomach just visible under her shirt. He didn't say anything, didn't want to jinx it, but Ayla caught him staring and smiled. "You see it too?" she asked. Colt nodded, his throat tight. "I think it happened back in Valley," Ayla said, "before we left." Colt crossed the room and placed his hand on her stomach, feeling the faint swell beneath his palm. "You scared?" he asked. "Terrified," Ayla admitted, "but also happy." Colt pulled her into his arms and held her tight. "We're going to be okay." "You think so?" "Yeah, I do." The baby came in November. It was a long, brutal labor, hours of pain and fear and blood. Colt had delivered calves and foals before, but this was different. This was Ayla, and the thought of losing her made his hands shake. But she was strong, stronger than he'd ever given her credit for. And when the baby finally came, a girl, tiny and red-faced and screaming, Colt felt something break open in his chest. Ayla held the baby against her chest, tears streaming down her face, and looked up at Colt. "She is perfect," Ayla whispered. Colt couldn't speak. He just nodded, his eyes burning. They named her River, because the river had tried to take Ayla, but instead it had brought them together. And now, here was this tiny, perfect life, proof that even the worst moments could lead to something beautiful. The years passed. River grew. She learned to walk, to talk, to run through the woods like she was born to it. She had Ayla's dark eyes and Colt's stubborn streak, and she was fearless in a way that both terrified and amazed them. Colt taught her to hunt, to track, to shoot. Ayla taught her to be strong, to be kind, to never let anyone tell her she wasn't enough. And every night, when they sat by the fire and River fell asleep between them, Colt felt the weight of everything they'd survived settle into something lighter. Gratitude. He'd spent so much of his life alone, so much of it angry and bitter, and convinced the world had nothing good to offer. But he'd been wrong, because here, in this small cabin in the middle of nowhere, with the woman he loved and the daughter they'd made together, Colt had found something he'd never thought he'd have: peace. Not the kind of peace that came from running away, but the kind that came from fighting for what mattered and refusing to give up. One evening, when River was 5, Ayla and Colt sat on the porch and watched her play in the yard. She was chasing fireflies, laughing and spinning in circles, her hair flying wild. "She is so much like you," Ayla said, smiling. "She's like you too," Colt said. "Strong, brave, stubborn as hell." Ayla laughed. "That is definitely you." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching their daughter. Then Ayla said, "Do you ever think about going back to Valley?" Colt thought about it. "Sometimes, but I don't think we need to." "Why not?" "Because we already have what we were looking for." He gestured to River, to the cabin, to the life they'd built. "This is enough." Ayla leaned her head against his shoulder. "Yes, it is." River ran up to the porch, breathless and grinning, holding a firefly cupped in her hands. "Look," she said, her eyes wide with wonder. Colt crouched down and looked at the glowing insect. "That's a good one." "Can I keep it?" "No," Ayla said gently. "It needs to be free, just like you." River pouted for a moment, then opened her hands and watched the firefly drift away into the darkening sky. "Will I always be free?" she asked. Ayla looked at Colt, and he saw the weight of that question in her eyes. "Yes," Colt said, "as long as you're strong enough to fight for it." River nodded solemnly, like she understood, and ran back into the yard. Colt stood and wrapped his arm around Ayla. "You think she'll be okay?" Ayla asked quietly. "In this world?" "Yeah," Colt said. "I think she'll be more than okay, because she's got you, and she's got me, and we're going to teach her how to survive anything." Ayla smiled, "Just like we did." "Yeah, just like we did." Years passed, and the world outside changed. The frontier shrank. Towns grew. The wild places became less wild. But in their small corner of the wilderness, Colt and Ayla built a life that was theirs alone. They grew old together. Colt's hair turned gray, his hands grew rough and gnarled. Ayla's legs ached more in the cold, and she moved slower than she used to. But she never stopped moving, never stopped fighting. River grew into a woman, strong, capable, unafraid. She married a man from the settlement, a quiet trapper who reminded Colt of himself. They built a cabin nearby, and soon there were grandchildren running through the woods, filling the air with laughter. Colt taught them the same things he'd taught River: how to track, how to hunt, how to survive. But more than that, he taught them what it meant to be strong. Not in the way the world defined it, not by how fast you could run or how hard you could hit, but by how much you could endure and still choose to stand back up. Because that's what strength really was. It wasn't about never falling, it was about getting back up, every time, no matter how hard it was. Colt died on a cold morning in March, 20 years after River was born. It was quick, painless. He was out checking the trap line when his heart gave out, and he fell into the snow like he was just lying down to rest. Ayla found him an hour later. She didn't cry. Not at first. She just sat beside him in the snow, holding his hand, and remembered. She remembered the river, the cabin, the fight, the years they'd spent building a life that no one thought was possible, and she realized something. Colt had saved her, but she'd saved him too. They'd saved each other, and that was enough. Ayla lived another 10 years after Colt died. She spent them watching her grandchildren grow, teaching them the stories of where they came from. She told them about the river that had tried to take her, and the man who jumped in to save her. She told them about the cabin they'd built, the valley they'd fought for, the life they'd made together. And she told them the most important lesson she'd learned: that strength wasn't about being perfect. It wasn't about never needing help. It was about choosing to keep going, even when the world told you to give up. It was about believing you were worth fighting for, even when everyone else said you weren't. It was about finding someone who saw you, really saw you, and deciding to build something together, no matter how impossible it seemed. When Ayla finally died, surrounded by her family, her last thought was of Colt. And she smiled, because she knew, wherever he was waiting for her, and they'd start all over again. River buried her mother beside her father on the hill overlooking the river. She stood there for a long time, her own children beside her, and thought about everything her parents had taught her. They'd taught her to be strong, to be brave, to never give up. But most of all, they'd taught her that love, real love, wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone worth fighting for, someone worth building a life with, no matter how hard it got. And that lesson, more than anything else, was the legacy they'd left behind. River turned and walked back down the hill, her children following. And as she went, she thought about the story she'd tell them someday. The story of a woman who was thrown into a river and left to die, and the man who jumped in to save her. It wasn't a story about perfection. It wasn't a story about heroes who never struggled or doubted or failed. It was a story about two broken people who found each other in the middle of nowhere and decided to build something beautiful. And in a world that often felt harsh and unforgiving, that was the most powerful story of all, because it proved that even in the darkest moments, even when everything seemed lost, there was always a choice. You could give up, or you could get back up. You could accept what the world said about you, or you could decide to prove them wrong. You could run from the hard things, or you could stand and fight. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you'd find someone willing to fight beside you. Someone who saw you, not as broken or weak or worthless, but as strong and valuable and worth saving. And that, River thought, was what her parents had really taught her. Not how to survive, but how to live. The river still runs through that valley, cold and clear and relentless. And if you go there on a quiet morning, when the mist rises off the water and the sun breaks over the eastern ridge, you might see the ruins of an old cabin. Just 4 walls half collapsed, reclaimed by the forest. But if you look closely, you'll see signs of the people who lived there. A stone hearth, still standing. A rusted pot, half buried in the dirt. A pair of wooden braces, carved with care and left behind like a promise. And if you stand there long enough, you might feel it. The weight of the choices they made. The love they fought for. The life they built against all odds. You might remember that strength isn't about never falling. It's about choosing to stand back up. You might remember that you're worth fighting for, even when the world says otherwise. You might remember that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is refuse to give up on someone, including yourself. And maybe, just maybe, you'll carry that lesson with you when you leave, because that's what stories do. They remind us that even in the hardest moments, even when everything feels impossible, there's always hope. There's always a choice. And sometimes, one impossible choice can change everything.